This is House Planning Help episode 98. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you want to self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this session, we're off to Michigan in the States for an owner-builder stroke architect case study. Christina Snyder from Equilibrium Energy Spaces is my guest. And before we get into that interview, I wanted to tell you about one of the clients that I've got on the go at the moment at Regen Media, because I think you'll be interested. Their project as part of Self Build Live, this is Potton that I'm talking about. If you're in the UK, you may know about them at the moment, offering a number of custom build solutions. But their current project, whereas in the past they've had a lot of traditional buildings, they're looking at a contemporary passive house, and they're sharing that whole experience online as part of Self Build Live. And this is where I obviously come in as Regen Media, and we're doing all the videos for that. So I'm going to embed one of those videos into the show notes. This is a project that they're putting together with SIPS panels, and I know a number of people seem to ask me about SIPS panels. So if you are one of those, this is Kingspan tech panels that are making this construction. And I couldn't believe it actually during the filming that fairly much an afternoon for a whole level of the building, you can see that speed is a definite advantage of SIPS panels. But take a look at the video that I've embedded, and if you want to see the whole range of videos, then there'll be a link for that as well. houseplanninghelp.com/98. Let's get to today's podcast. I think it's safe to say that Christina Snyder has a love for building. You're going to hear it in this story. In fact, I almost wonder whether her build is a lifestyle. You'll see what I mean as we get into this. So this is especially relevant for you if you're undertaking a lot of the work yourself, you're doing the self-build. What's that going to mean? How might timescales change? And if, like Christina, you want to be experimental too, just because you want to be, how's that going to affect you? I think this is a pretty good interview for that. I started by asking her to tell me a little bit about herself and her interest in green building.
Well, as a young person, I was helping my father to make solar renovations on our home. And I also started in high school even designing. I won a design competition for a solar house in high school. And then off to college, and I kept trying to pursue those interests through college. And then after I graduated, I lost one job just before 9/11, the terrorist attack. And so there were no more jobs in architecture offices. So I started teaching students how to design zero-energy homes. There was a state competition that allowed students to enter and compete against each other to design a zero-energy house for Michigan. And we ended up, the students of the school that I was working for ended up winning the competition twice in a row. So that was getting too boring, so they discontinued the competition after we wrapped up all three prizes the second year. And then we entered a solar decathlon, and about that time I learned about Passivhaus. I remember it was because the University of Darmstadt won that competition, beat the pants off us with the Passivhaus. So I figured if you can't beat them, you got to join them. So then I started taking the Passivhaus training and became a certified Passivhaus consultant. And I should also mention I had married a fellow who was a renewable energy systems installer. So
that's where all this solar comes from.
Yeah.
The solar interest.
Solar and wind.
I hear that you are building your own house, and this is a project that's live at the moment, but there are a number of different facets to it. So have you ever built a house before?
Well, I grew up working construction from the time that I was big enough to, my earliest toys were cutoffs from blocks that were cutoffs from a construction site, and I would be Daddy's right-hand girl and hand him the tools he asked for. So I was on construction sites from the time I was old enough to get in trouble. So.
And in terms of your own home, have you lived in one that you've built before?
No, but I did a lot of renovating on other people's homes growing up, and even some new construction work as well.
Why did you want to?
I should say that my father built the house that we were living in, but that was before I was born. but it was an ongoing project finishing it. We moved into it before it got its first coat of paint, so that was something like 20 years later.
How have the types of houses that you've lived in changed?
The houses that I've lived in, I guess it was about high school that my dad renovated the house that he had originally built to make it more of a solar home. It didn't really have the best orientation to be a solar home, but we enclosed a south-facing greenhouse space and added more insulation to the walls and roof and stuff. So, and then, while in college, I actually worked my way through school partly by helping my landlord to do renovations on an old historic home. So that was pretty fun. And I currently live in a very old, 100-year-old farmhouse that has very little insulation at all. So it makes me appreciate the passive house that's under construction, because already with the heating systems set down at 55 degrees, it's warmer than the house that has the furnace set at 60-some degrees.
As someone who knows a lot about construction, when it comes to your own project, you want to push the boundaries a bit. So tell me, what is different about this project and what do you set out to achieve by the end of it?
What's different about this project is that it's doing a lot of things that haven't really been brought together before into a single project, at least not in Michigan. So I've got the passive house stuff. We're going to try to go all the way to zero energy and be able to power the house with nickel iron battery system like Thomas Edison's first batteries. They're less toxic. So we'll have solar hot water, wind, and we're actually going to try to do some seasonal space heating where we'll take the surplus energy from the solar hot water system in the summertime, put it into a seasonal heat storage tank, whatever we don't need for the domestic hot water loads. And then in the wintertime, we should still have enough solar hot water for our domestic hot water, but we can take the surplus heat that's still in that tank from the fall and be able to heat most of the way through the winter by putting it into radiant floors in the house. We also have a composting toilet, and we'll be looking at doing gray water treatment and rainwater storage and a whole bunch of other things like that are rather experimental in terms of what most code officials would see. But they haven't given us any trouble about it because I am basically owner, builder, architect. So if anything goes wrong, it's my fault. I can't point at the code official. It was all my idea. So
clearly you're taking on a lot with this project, from financing it to finding the location to designing it. Does that ever cause you concern that you're doing too much of it?
My husband says we're on the bleeding edge of technology, and that's certainly true. But there's a long history of architects experimenting on their own homes, and this is not the sort of thing you want to do your learning curve on a client's house. So we only have money to build one house. We're going to throw all these experiments into one big pile, and it's probably going to be, a couple decade project by the time we get everything, I don't know if it'll ever be house beautiful, but that wasn't really one of the goals for us. So
that's quite something to say, a couple of decade project, and you're totally unfazed by that, or it has to be this way.
Well, as I said, the childhood home that I grew up in, I never realized it growing up, but the first coat of paint went on 20 years later. So it's not that the construction may be continuous that whole time. It's just that we'll do it in phases, and we'll constantly be tweaking the results that we get. I have some friends that have a house that's been under construction for 30-some years.
I think that's a record. I'm not sure.
Some people just enjoy, it's kind of like the nesting instinct, you enjoy tinkering with your house if you're that kind of mentality. So
All right, then. Let's start out with the beginning of this project. So how did you find land? Was it just an open patch of land, or is this a rebuild? Or?
We did some searching. It's actually rather difficult to find a good solar exposure. By that, I mean I want to have sunshine year-round from at least 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. is my ideal. That's not entirely necessary for a certified passive house, but the better you can get, the easier it's going to be to hit the mark. And, we didn't want to just have a passive house, but also to go all the way to zero energy, where all of our energy needs would be met from current sunshine and wind.
And this is a rural area.
It's a rural area. We ended up settling near some neighbors of ours who run a certified, it's called a CSA, Sustainable Agriculture. So it's a certified organic farm, but it's a subscription type farming where people buy shares of the organic food. So they're good friends of us, and it's nice to be within walking distance of them. But we searched pretty much through the whole city, and you can't just go onto a real estate website and type in, I want a good solar exposure. So we did a lot of looking at the satellite photos. We visited a lot of sites with our solar pathfinder to take measurements before we actually decided where we wanted to be.
And how soon after acquiring that plot did you then move on to designing and building? And I get the feeling that this ongoing process might be different to what a lot of people are doing. But tell me about that.
The farmer that previously owned the land was a bachelor farmer, and he needed to sell because of the economic downturn. So in some ways, that economic downturn played into our favor, because not only was the land took a drop in price and we were able to afford it better when he decided to put it on auction, but we also didn't have to fight to get labor assistance or materials. Those sorts of issues were much better in the downturn.
How much of this house is into the earth and how much is above ground?
So the house has 3 stories of windows on the south and it's got 2 levels on the north, but the lowest story on the north has no windows at all. And the windows on the second level on the north, the ground is coming just in below those windows, and they're as high as they can be and still serve as egress windows. The windows on the first floor on the south have the same kind of relationship to the ground. So there's a full another story on the north side than the south side. When you look at the pictures, you'll see a little structure on the north side of the building that was kind of our practice structure, but it's for storing rainwater, and that will pretty much be completely below the ground level.
So take us through the process then of how you're progressing.
So we broke ground in 2011, and it was a very deep hole. The ground floor of the house is going to be like 14 feet below ground on the north side of the house and about 4 feet on the south side. And we had a hard time keeping that hole open that year because it was a record wet year. So we pretty much got the foundations and the first tier of foam on that year. And I haven't mentioned yet that the construction of the house, the basement level, everything that's buried below ground, is 16-inch thick slabs of the white EPS beadboard, like styrofoam cups, but it's a little bit denser. Then we set those up and glued them together and then coated both sides with glass fiber reinforced concrete, about 1/2 inch on the inside and the outside of the foam. And that makes it into a structural insulated panel that's incredibly strong. And it's also the weather barrier. And on the inside of the house, it serves as the air barrier that keeps moist air from inside the house from leaking into the walls.
That's the foundations that we're talking about there. And on top of that, what structure have you got?
When we started the project, we actually thought we were going to build the entire house that way. So it would have kind of been like an ice chest house. And then it took us a lot longer than we thought it would because we had a pretty steep learning curve. The people that first turned us onto the building system wanted $70,000 to train us. not including equipment. And we said, we can't do that. So we found out who their suppliers were from a fellow that makes the equipment that they use. And so between the equipment manufacturer and the suppliers, we were able to piece together a recipe and start experimenting. But in a large extent, we were pretty self-taught with our method. And that's probably why we still don't have it perfected enough to do it for somebody else. We ended up at one point hiring a fellow who's been doing it professionally for more than 10 years, and he's got his own specially developed chemical recipe for the concrete that he won't disclose to anybody. But, it probably takes a good 10 years to get really good at doing this method of building. And that's why it took us so long, owner building to make that happen.
So was that the right choice then in your mind? If it's something that's quite complex to get a good grip on, you didn't consider other ways of doing this. Why were you so keen?
It wouldn't have been good for a client, but we wanted to build in the south side of a hill, earth sheltering, and we needed to meet the Passivhaus standard. We needed like an R60 wall. So if we had done insulated concrete forms where you've got about 6 to 8 inches of concrete in the middle, then the entire wall assembly would have been like close to 2 feet thick. And it still wouldn't have been easy to do. So this seemed like a logical way to get the amount of insulation that we needed. And it would be very strong, and it would have much less CO2 emissions, because you can't make cement without making an equal amount of carbon dioxide emissions. It's just part of the chemical reaction.
Let me just almost paint the picture a bit, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here. But so who is working on site as you're doing this? Have you done this with your hands, this whole...
Mostly my husband and I were working on this site, and we would set up the foam, and when we got a certain amount of it done, we would have a spray day. And when we did a spray day with the large equipment, it's a really grueling process, because once you get started with that equipment, you pretty much can't take a break, because the concrete would set up in the hoses. So we would do about 8, maybe 9 hours of nonstop spraying the concrete on the wall, and then it'd be another hour of cleanup afterwards. And we'd have like a crew we needed at least 6 people to help us, but they weren't especially skilled labor. We kind of taught them as we learned.
And when do you need that concrete layer through the different elements? I'm just trying to get it clear in my mind.
The fellow who does it professionally, I believe he sets up the entire styrofoam walls from ground to all the way up to the roof level, builds those up before he puts any concrete on it at all. And then he just goes like crazy for a week spraying it or more. But when we first started, we weren't sure how strong the system was, never having done it before. And so we were trying to do each tier of foam as we went up to attach them together. And now I have a lot more confidence that that's not necessary. So when we made the jump from finishing the first floor level to getting ready to put the second floor level on with wood walls on the south and the east side of the building where they weren't going to be below grade, we had the carpenters coming in the week before. I was erecting all this foam that was going to hold the roof up on the north side. And rather than trying to coat it all with concrete, I just sort of taped the seams and plastered the seams with some concrete, and the rest of the foam was bare. And it carried the roof loads for over a year through the winter and into the next season with bare foam.
Every so often when I'm doing this podcast, I realize that audio is not good and we need diagrams and pictures, which is why we have on our website things to back up this particular interview.
I have some pictures I can...
Definitely. I think that will help clarify what's going on here in case, because I'm still, I think I've asked enough questions about it, but I want to see it. So does this take us up to date then of where you are on the build? Because you're still in the middle of this.
We got the carpenters were able to help us get the wood walls, which are made out of eye joists instead of dimensional lumber and the roof trusses on before last winter. So it's been a little over a year that those have been up in place. And last summer we got the roof on and all the insulation in the walls, the cellulose insulation in the walls. So that's about where we're at. We got the windows in except for 2.
Is there a danger that these components might be deteriorating in the time that it takes to get it weather tight?
You can actually notice with the foam that it gets yellow when it's exposed to the sunlight. I did try to keep the foam tarped when it was in storage on the site and much of the time that it was erected, but it's not a big problem when it's yellowed because you can take a rasp and just rasp off the part that's yellowed and get down to the pure white foam again, and then you can still get a good bond with the concrete.
How long has this project been going on now?
It'll be a little bit under 5 years now. So.
When do you hope to move in?
Well, that answer hasn't changed much. I keep saying, it'll be about a year from now. But that's pushing the horizon out farther and farther. So we'll probably go ahead and try to move in as soon as we get the certificate of occupancy. And it may be a little bit over a year, but not much more now.
Maybe we should schedule the next podcast then of the follow-up of what actually happened. Are there any other aspects that we haven't looked at that are worth mentioning or that are unusual?
Well, we have root cellars. My husband was living for better part of 20-some years as a vegetarian on locally grown food. So he's very much into having the proper climate for each type of food. So we have 3 different rooms that will each have different combination of temperature and humidity, mostly passively. So, and I have actually stored apples for over a year and the first half of the year without any refrigeration, and they're still edible and good. And so the apples moved in before we did.
I think I remember seeing one house here in the UK where they had a section that was it was outside the thermal envelope, but there as a larder, that because our temperature in the UK is often quite cold, it worked perfectly that it was just outside. You wouldn't necessarily notice it unless you knew how it was designed. But I thought that was a clever addition. Yeah.
In this case, the larder or the food storage rooms are actually below the frost line, so they should stay cool like a cave year round.
That sounds like a cellar and get some wine down there.
If we were into wine, that's where it would be.
What has been the biggest challenge so far?
Well, they say that if you really want to test your marriage, try building a house. So there were some rocky times, and I don't think they're over yet, but we're still together, and I'm very much pleased and hope, that we will be for the next 14, 15 years is about how far we're into it now. So,
okay, I think then we have more or less covered most of the aspects. We'll, in the show notes, have some pictures and different bits and pieces. Christina, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session. They're at houseplanninghelp.com/98. We've got a summary of everything that we've talked about today, or you can download the transcript and get the full conversation. There are photos of the house build up to its current stage, all at houseplanninghelp.com/98, and you can leave a comment or question at the bottom if you so choose as well. My call to action today is to sign up to our email newsletter. You might want to do this because we provide you with more tips, tools, and inspiration to get you moving on your build. Also, you get those emails from me. I actually write them. No one else is doing this. So you'll get those updates if I've got a fresh podcast or a blog post that I think that you'd really like to see. And it also gives you the chance to email me because you can just hit reply, and I answer a lot of emails that I get until it gets to a stage where it's unsustainable. I am quite happy to interact with you if you've got a question or something else that you think should be on the podcast. houseplanninghelp.com/subscribe. So that's us done for today. Thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it every time you lending me your ears for half an hour or so. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.